I got a one-track mind, like a steam engine at the end of the line.
That's Matthew Bannister playing History Train, one of 15 tracks from his new album, The Dark Backward, a record that the former Sneaky Feeling member calls a musical journey back and forth across decades. We found Matthew at home in Hamilton and asked him what the title The Dark Backward means.
Okay, so it's kind of a quote from Shakespeare that in The Tempest, he
Uh-huh.
says, Prospero says, the dark backward and abysm of time. And he's talking about the past, basically.
Right?
So it's a reference to the past, I guess.
All right.
Um, and I guess that's also continued in the cover image, which is actually an image of Argyle Street, Glasgow, where I lived as a 4-year-old. And the photograph was taken by my father, so
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask
um,
you about the photo, so that answers that question. And what do you remember about that time and place?
well, I remember it kind of looks kind of dark and sort of a bit sort of depressing, but I remember it as being a happy time, as a 4-year-old. I wasn't worried about the fact that we were living in a sort of city looking tenement in the middle of a dirty industrial town. I didn't have any problem. My dad said I used to jump over the legs of the drunks in the street.
Well, that's all right. Yep. Yeah, it's nice to know that when you're that age, stuff that everybody else is stressed out about, you're kind of blissfully ignorant and having a good time.
Yeah, yeah, sure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep. So the songs that make up the album, were they created with this kind of nostalgic look back in mind, or that did you happen to come together like this?
Well, I've always sort of written a few songs here and there about sort of time. So it was partly like a little bit of a retrospective in the sense I thought, well, I can use some old songs that I wrote that were also about time and then it also be like a kind of, time in the sense of a retrospective. But most of the material is newer than that.
Uh-huh.
So it is a mixture in that sense. Like there's one song in it which is a dribbling darts song, which
Right?
is from No Sooner Here Than It's Gone, which is, like life is life's unrepeatable, time is unbeatable. It's no sooner here than it's gone.
Isn't it cheating to keep on repeating what's no longer true? And you got so tired of stoking the fire, and now my hands are blue. So let's not waste time investigating the crime of what, where, why, or
And
And
it's
that
sort of
was from back in 91, was it?
yeah, that's right.
Uh,
So that was when I was in the Dribbling Darts of Love, who was like my post sort of Sneaky Feelings group.
right, right. It's got kind of a 50s ballad feel to it. Is that something that you kind of latch onto from time to time, or
Yeah, well, I mean, and certainly in Sneaky Feelings, we were kind of very interested in pop music history, and like some of the other Flying Nun bands, we were actually kind of interested in the '60s, especially as a kind
sure?
of
Yeah.
of sort of musical diversity and different styles. And so, we were definitely open to things like that kind of sort of folk ballad style, which I think the Byrds kind of electrified. And so that was kind of yeah, a reference.
Yep, yep, yep. And the album opens with "Floating in the River of Time," which is the single that's off the album. What can you tell me? When was that written and recorded?
floating in the river of time, floating but I cannot decide which way the river's flowing at the rate I'm going. Will I reach the other side? Swimming, but the ocean is wide. Swim against the rising tide. The way the current's flowing at the rate I'm going. Will I reach the other side?
It was about a couple of things. The first was in Hamilton we have the River Waikato,
Right.
and in a bold sort of mood, one day I decided to swim across the river. People do swim in the river in the Waikato. It's basically probably okay as long as you don't put your head under.
Right.
But
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever swum in a river, but it's kind of a scary experience because of course at some point the current starts carrying you along,
Right.
and then you kind of realize that you're not entirely in control. But if as long as you don't panic and you just keep going, you will actually get to the other side. It's just that you'll be, 100 meters downstream. You just have to keep sort of swimming. So it was partly about that experience of being caught in the flow, but also I think about a kind of almost a philosophical question, which is, if time is a river, then which way does it flow?
Hmm.
Are we swinging against the current or are we borne along by the current?
Right.
What exactly does this metaphor mean in terms of our lives and how we
Right.
kind
Right.
of tackle sort of, how to live and stuff.
Right. And I think for a lot of people, they might feel like they're swimming against the tide these days. They're going through some
Indeed.
stuff. How has it been for you?
Um, yeah, well, it's hard to avoid the kind
Yeah.
of doom. And there are a couple of songs, which are sort of slightly future oriented on the record, or sort of thinking about, the challenges that humanity faces.
Right.
There's one called Midnight Explosions, which is kind of well, it was based on the memory of sort of being in Hamilton and waking up in the middle of the night, because and I'd had this dream about sort of about explosions and stuff. And then, of course, the neighbors were letting off fireworks in the garden,
Thank
and
you.
so and this and this was also the time when there were all the bushfires in Australia, and whenever the sun went down, the sky would be totally red.
Right.
And then you got these explosions in the middle of the night, and so it just sort of set off a kind of a slightly apocalyptic mood in my mind, which I thought about in the song, sort of using the fireworks as a kind of metaphor.
Midnight explosions, shot in the dark, rockets exploding just for a lark, setting off fireworks, letting off steam, thunder and lightning in my dream.
So is that how songwriting works for you? You're just kind of triggered by something that's happening on day-to-day living and off you go?
Well, I guess in those examples, I suppose because, one's about swimming in a river and one's about being
Right.
woken up by fire. So yeah, those are kind of, fairly direct inspirations from life. I mean, sometimes I'm also inspired by kind of past music, which I guess is another theme. I mean, nostalgia is a theme, I suppose.
Uh-huh.
Um, like for instance, there's a song on the record, "What's So Good About the '60s,"
Right.
which is which is kind of well, it's a sort of a play on words based on the fact that, us people that were born in the '60s. I don't know if you're one of those. You probably are. Um,
50s.
oh, you were born like Sting.
There's no reason for derogatory remarks, but yes, I guess so.
I don't think that wasn't intended to be derogatory.
I'm just kidding.
But anyway, people who are born in the '60s are now in their '60s.
That's correct.
And
Yes.
so I think this is kind of an interesting kind of paradox. And that it's almost like there's some weird resemblances between, people in the '60s and what they did, the whole hippie kind of culture
Right.
and kind of getting old now, it's like you don't have to cut your hair anymore because it's falling out.
Yeah, it's gone.
You stay in bed and take drugs, because you're old, as opposed to in the '60s you did it because you were young.
Right.
So, like, second childhood kind of thing,
Yeah, yeah,
life
yeah.
kind life goes around in a circle.
If you remember the 60s, you weren't there at the time. Everybody's on drugs, spend all day in bed. They don't get out much out of their heads.
Yeah. And I noticed you threw in a little bit of the birds at the end there, a little so you want to be a rock and roll star. So
Yeah,
obviously,
well, it sort of fitted in the chords, and then of course, it sort of fitted as a reference back to the kind of, I guess, because of course the whole idea of being a rock star was something that was invented in the '60s.
yes, of course. And when did you decide you wanted to be a rock star?
Um, well, probably when I was about 12 or 13, and I just kind of figured it would probably be a good way to meet girls.
Yeah.
I mean, that was definitely a major motivation. And I have to say that it kind of worked out. Like most of my girlfriends have been people I met through music.
Right,
And so is my partner as well. So, I think if I hadn't gotten to music, I'd probably be a lonely old man. So,
right,
you know, so that kind of that worked.
right, right. And was there were the Byrds a band that inspired you musically and when you started out making music, or was there other things
I
going
think
on?
it was initially the Beatles and the sort of British sort of 60s bands like the Kinks and the Who and the
Right.
Stars that kind of got me started. But then when I went to New Zealand, weirdly, my kind of musical listening expanded a lot because like Martin Durrant, who was the drummer in Sneaky Feelings, like he had a huge record collection. Like,
Uh-huh.
he listened to heaps of stuff, including kind of like, sort of 60s soul music and, and girl groups and, and as well as lots of 70s kind of stuff, sort of the bands, Steely Dan, Van Morrison,
Uh-huh.
um, all these people. And so he kind of really kind of expanded my listening kind of palette and made me aware of a lot of different kinds of music. And then of course also we could go to the record shop in Dunedin in the second Roy Colbert's shop, and and if we didn't have a record, but we'd read about it in the Rolling Stone record guide, we could go say, look, Roy, have you got this record? And if he said yeah, we said, well, you tape it for me, and
Right.
he was very gracious for us, and he would you give him a cassette and he'd tape a couple of albums for you, and you could go away and listen to them. So yeah, there was a lot of, listening, thoughtful listening to the mainly to the past, but also to the present, because we were also interested in the contemporary music scene as well.
Yep, yep, yep. And one song I want to touch on was History Train, because I believe that's kind of about you in the being a train spotter yourself. The concept, me being mostly American, is completely foreign other than the term from the film. So, what is the
Oh,
attraction to being a
yeah,
train spotter?
again, there's a weird sort of a weird relationship here because I was a Scottish train spotter. I
Right.
literally grew up in Scotland, and I actually, and I used to go to train stations and depots and write down the numbers of locomotives, which is what train spotters do.
It's a train spotter's paradise. Just picture yourself on a ticket to ride. All the hits are coming your way. Don't touch that dial or be led astray. You've heard it all before. That's the way you like it.
So yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't the glamorous kind of train spotting where you take heroin and stuff.
Probably
Um,
better for you though.
Probably better for me in the long run. And then when I was and I used to have like a model train set as well.
Right.
I might point out that quite a lot of rock stars have model train layouts. Neil Young and Rod
Neil
Stewart, for
Young's
example.
big on the Lionels, right?
But when I was 15, I sold my model train set to my brother, and I bought an electric guitar. So literally, trains led me to music.
Right.
At some choice, that I was going to be a musician as opposed to a train spotter.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I'm still kind of a train spotting musician, in the sort of like nerdy sort of, music history way.
Yep. And so are you kind of a student of music history now? Have you kind of gone and down deep wells and dug, done some, because it's easy to find just about anything on the net these days.
Yeah, well, I mean, I work at Wintec, so Waikato Polytech, and I supervise postgraduate students. So
Oh,
I do like academic research, and I publish articles about music.
right.
Uh, yes, I do quite a lot of research into music as well.
Huh?
So that I'm kind of wearing my sort of intellectual hat,
Yep.
as opposed to my kind of, creative hat. I kind of do both things. And Wintec, to be fair, I mean, kind of reward me because, these days putting out an album is like a research output.
Right.
They will actually kind of fund that to some degree. And, that goes alongside my other, sort of academic kind of outputs. So yeah, I do both things.
Oh, that's nice to hear that you're managed to combine it. Because let's face it, nobody's getting rich putting out music anymore. So there
No,
has to be some other way around it. And so, what kind of
no,
research I'm curious about the research. So, what kind of music do you research? Is it New Zealand music? Is it just kind of whatever, catches your
I've done a few
interest?
types. I mean, my PhD thesis was about the New Zealand in alternative music scene.
Right?
I mean, it was really about my experience in playing in flying nun bands in the 1980s.
Right.
That whole kind of scene and how it happened and how it how it kind of saw itself, um, and the kind of mythology of kind of that got built up around the Dunedin sound in particular.
Yep.
Um, so that was New Zealand music, but I've also written quite a lot about the Beatles because they're probably my favorite group of all time,
Right.
and I feel like I know them well enough to speak authoritatively about them.
Yep.
Um, right recently, I published an article about the Ruttles,
Oh, okay.
um, in like a Polish journal called Panopticon, so that's kind of weird in itself. Um, but it was about, it was a special issue about biopics,
Right.
and I'm sort of interested in music biopics because there's been so many of them recently.
Yeah.
I was kind of arguing that the Ruttles was like the first music biopic in some ways because it was a story played by actors, but it was based on the Beatles.
Sure.
There hadn't really been a lot of, biopics before that, so it was almost like, and so I guess my point was that the genre kind of started as a joke.
Right.
It started as a parody, and then
Yep.
later on it got serious, which is something that happens in rock and roll quite a lot.
Yes.
Things start as jokes, or and then they later on they become people start taking them seriously.
That's
Like you could
very
say
cool.
the whole of rock and roll is kind of like a joke that people have decided to take seriously.
I like that idea. I've never thought of it like that. Yeah, I remember Neil Innes from the Ruddles played here at King's Arms. Uh,
I was at that gig.
yeah, it was a good
Yeah.
one, eh? He's
Oh yeah, I love doing this.
that's fantastic. And have you seen some of the biopics recently, the Dylan and whatever else is floating around?
Yeah, I've watched the Dylan one. I've just been watching the Robbie Williams one, the one which he's played
Oh
by a
yeah, I've
chimpanzee.
got to see that yet.
Guy chimpanzee.
He's played by
Um, well, I think I think it's quite an interesting film because of the way it uses a CGI. Really, it's to make almost like it's a gamification of the biopic. To get
yeah,
this avatar appearing as Robbie Williams. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's also he's sort of to some degree sort of criticizing some of the ideas about rock stardom,
sure.
the prevalent ideas, I guess, or almost like the American ideas, you might say,
Yep.
by sort of British cheeky chappy and stuff like that. And so slightly taking the piss with the whole sort of chimpanzee gag thing.
Yes. That's it.
But,
Have you ever dabbled in filmmaking yourself?
not really. I mean, I've made a few videos,
Right.
um, but some of which were better than others. When we were in Sneaky Feelings, we made a few, but they were all mostly pretty terrible.
Right.
And later on, I kind of figured out a bit better how to make it. And I realized that the best way to do it is to basically treat it as a joke, not take it too seriously. And then you can sort of laugh at yourself, and you can say, well, at least it's intentional, as
Yeah,
opposed to
right, right, right. That's right. All right. So the album has been out for a little bit. What are you up to next? What are you thinking about music wise? As you
Well, we're doing some shows. We played in Wellington last weekend.
How'd that
We're
go?
doing, yeah, pretty well. We played with the Doubtful Sounds
Oh,
and
great.
Alan Galloway and Caroline Esther, who used to play in Let's Planet.
Right.
We got a pretty good crowd, and yeah, it was good. Next week we're playing Hamilton, and then on March 22nd we're playing in Auckland at the Cupid Bar
Oh, yeah, that'll
in
be good. Excellent.
Chevalier.
Mhm.
But beyond that, I don't have any like huge plans at the minute. I mean, one it would be nice to have play with the Sneaky Feelings again, but
Right.
um, unfortunately, one of our members is overseas.
Mm,
He's working overseas, so he probably won't be back for another year or so at least. So, but in the meantime, I have my group in Hamilton, the Changing Same,
right.
and they're supporting me. They're sort of backing me for these gigs.
Right.
They only play on one track on the album, but they're being live. They're doing the songs.
Cool.
They're doing but yeah, the album was sort of conceived and written as a solo piece, but Yes, the pieces, the work, the songs are translating quite well to live
Oh,
performances.
good. Well, yeah, I'll have to catch the show. I love the Cupid Bar. It's a nice little place to hang. So, yeah. If you enjoyed this episode of the 13th Floor's Music Talk series, please be sure to subscribe to the website or to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram and wherever you find your podcasts. There's a whole lot more to discover.